All right, so this is definitely an interesting one. What we have here is a lunchbox sized gaming PC that I think is pretty impressive. Fairly compact and portable, but it's also incredibly quiet, fitting an absolutely massive air cooler. And with the way I have it configured here, it can handle just about any game at 1440p or 4K without issue. So that's what we're gonna build today. So let's take a look at the parts I chose for this build, see what it's like to put it all together, then we can check out the thermal and gaming performance. Now, later on, we'll talk about this video sponsor Squarespace, but for now, let's get started. The CPU I'll be using is the Intel i5-13600K. This has been my go-to Intel CPU for gaming this year. It has 14 cores, 6 of which are performance cores, and it can boost up to 5.1 gigahertz. Now, considering the cooling support, you could properly cool any high-end CPU you would want. You could easily go with an i9 processor if you're wanting a top-of-the-line productivity machine with an Intel chip, or on the AMD side, you could get away with a 7800X3D, which is always a top choice for gaming, while the 7950X3D is going to give you that top-tier productivity performance. Otherwise, the 13600K is a known quantity at this point, and it's still a really great choice for gaming. As far as the board we're gonna plug this into, that's gonna be the Asus ROG Strix B760i. Now, this is a B series motherboard, so it's gonna have those mid-range features, but it's also not gonna be as costly as those higher end motherboards like the Z series boards. The K suffix in 13600K denotes an unlocked gaming CPU. To take advantage of that, you will need a motherboard that can support overclocking. So you would wanna look for something like a Z series board if that's important to you. Now, those can be more expensive, and you would need to decide for yourself if overclocking your CPU is worth that extra cost. Now, I personally don't think so, at least not with this processor. So if you can find it, you could instead go with the 13600 without the K to save some money. Now, going from a B series board to a Z series board isn't gonna improve your gaming performance if you aren't planning to overclock your CPU. So at that point, you would be paying for some extra features, but I believe that the vast majority of people are gonna have everything they need in a B series motherboard. This one has built-in Wi-Fi 6E and ample I/O. On the front, you've got all your standard connections, including USB 3.0 and Type-C headers, as well as 2 M.2 slots. The primary M.2 slot is under this heatsink on the front, where I'll be putting a 1TB Samsung 970 EVO stick. And the second one is located on the back, which in this case is actually very easily accessible even after the entire PC is built. Now, because we are going 13th gen Intel, you have the option to save some money and get a last generation motherboard with DDR4 RAM. But today we're gonna be sticking with DDR5, and so I'll be running 32 gigs of DDR5 5600 Corsair Vengeance RAM. The Assassin 4 cooler that we'll be using is supposed to give 100% RAM clearance, but that really doesn't seem to be the case on this ITX board, as it does overhang that first DIMM slot. So we will need to use low clearance sticks here. The ones I have here should fit perfectly under the cooler at only 35 millimeters in height. Now, the case I'm gonna be using in this build is the G200. So this is from the same company that made the Lunchbox build I did a few months ago in the S300. They also have a few different sizes of that case, including the S4 and 500. This one here is 12.8 liters in volume and has more of a cube design to make room for those massive air coolers, along with mesh that continues across the top and the front of the case, as well as the entire side panel for maximum airflow. It's mostly made of aluminum, including the mesh panels, and it all feels really rigid and high quality. It's also probably one of the easiest cases I've ever built in. The case comes fully assembled, and you can easily remove the power supply bracket and the bar across the side that contains the case I/O for the power button, along with the USB 3.0 and USB-C port. And on the top is a pretty strong leather handle. The fully built system weighs about 15 pounds, and it seems to be supporting the weight so far when I've moved it around. So it does feel pretty solid. Okay, so let's grab the motherboard and secure it into the case. Now, this case can also fit an ATX power supply, and that's what I was originally planning on doing. But in order to have enough clearance for the graphics card, you do need one that is under 140 millimeters in length. So a good option for that would be something like the Corsair RM750E or the 850E. You can actually go to PC Part Picker and narrow them down to size to under that 140 millimeters if you want to pick one out. And that actually might save you upwards of, I don't know, $50 or so compared to the power supply that I'm going to be using here. Unfortunately, I don't have an extra 850E on hand, so I'll be using the Corsair SF750. Now, luckily, the SF750 does include an ATX conversion bracket in the box, as there's not actually one included with the case. And kind of a happy accident here is that it does leave enough room to run a triple fan setup on that massive air cooler. You might be able to fit the third fan with an ATX power supply, but This does give the third fan more room for airflow, and it does make for a slightly easier build when it comes to cable management. All right, so we can remove the power supply bracket and then secure both the conversion bracket and the case bracket to the SF750. Then I'm gonna plug in all of my power cables now while they're a little bit easier to access, and then install it all together into the case. But don't forget to plug in the power extension cable and turn on the power supply, because that's not gonna be as easy to access once we screw everything into the case. So now I wanna take a minute to talk about this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace makes building a website simple. You start off by choosing from one of their hundreds of available templates, then they give you all the tools you need to customize it to fit your brand and needs. You can add a video library, a blog, a portfolio gallery, or even a custom online store to sell any of your digital or physical goods, which is conveniently controlled right on the Squarespace website. That includes an analytics section to keep track of all your website stats and orders. You can also set up an online calendar for your customers to easily book an appointment with you, or use the marketing section to create email campaigns. Even if you only need a simple portfolio, Squarespace is the ideal platform to use. Whenever you're ready to get started, you can sign up for a completely free trial using the link squarespace.com/DevinJohnston. And if you use the code DevinJohnston at checkout, you can save 10% on your first purchase of a website or domain. Okay, now comes the graphics card, and I'm gonna be using the AMD 7900 XT. So this particular card that I bought from PowerColor is 290 millimeters, which honestly well exceeds that 275 millimeter recommendation for this case. But that's not gonna stop me from trying anyway. So I actually had to unscrew a few spots along the sides of the front panel to give me enough room to actually even install the GPU. And so I did need to apply a little bit of pressure to re-secure that front panel. And so it is pushing up against the front panel, but luckily it's not really enough to even make the panel bulge or anything, which I think is a testament to the rigid build quality of the case. So honestly, I probably would not recommend getting one this long. I would go for something around 285 millimeters or below, and you should be good with that. In terms of cooling performance, the triple fans on the card are facing downwards, working against a ventilated aluminum panel and a mesh dust filter that all stand about a 1/4 inch above the desk. This setup seems to provide the card with enough decent airflow, as I'm seeing temperatures in the mid to high 70 degrees Celsius under a full gaming load. Now, however, it obviously won't run as cool as it would in a larger, micro ATX case, where I've seen the temperatures on the same card in the low 70 degrees. In Alan Wake 2, with no upscaling or ray tracing enabled, at a native 3440 by 1440 ultra wide resolution, I'm seeing around 65 to 70 frames per second. Then turning on FSR2, we see a nice bump to over 120 frames. Then jumping into Cyberpunk 2077 at the same resolution, using the ultra preset, but turning off upscaling, I am seeing around 75 frames per second, and then over 90 with FSR enabled. All right, and so now we're finally ready to install the centerpiece of the whole build, and that is the Deepcool Assassin 4. Now, this is a high-end air cooler that should be able to handle anything you'd want to throw at it, including an i9 processor, so I think we will be more than good with the 13600K. This thing is pretty massive and not something that you would typically think of for an ITX build, but that's kind of the headlining feature of this case. It officially supports a cooler up to 160 millimeters in height. However, this is 164 millimeters. So we are pushing that max limit here, but I just kind of had to give it a try because come on, the design of the case and the cooler, they look like they were made for each other. I mean, I think the design of this cooler just looks so clean, with the fans and the heatsink seamlessly fitting together into a giant black cube. They have a pretty clever way of accessing that center fan. This center panel really pops off, and then once you squeeze these two tabs together, it unlocks the fan so that you can slide it out. From there, you're able to access the mounting screws. And the whole mounting process is exactly how you would expect. For Intel 1700, you just feed the backplate through the 4 holes on the motherboard, tighten the standoffs, then secure the mounting brackets to the standoffs. So now we can spread some thermal paste and lower the cooler into the case. You will want to make sure that you connect those fans to the CPU fan header before securing the cooler, because there's basically no room for your hand to fit in there once it's all installed. Now, even though the cooler is slightly sticking out from the case once it's installed, the side panel actually adds a few millimeters and it doesn't even touch the cooler. There's probably only about a millimeter or so of space, but it is a perfect fit. And because I'm using this SFX power supply, there's plenty of room to use the included third fan bracket. So I'm gonna attach an FK120 fan to really max out the cooling potential here. You might be able to fit this third fan with an ATX power supply, but it might not give you access to enough fresh air. With the SFX power supply, there is plenty of room. For noise levels, I'm getting around 43 decibels using the silent mode switch directly on the Assassin, and 45 decibels when it's switched to performance mode. And as far as thermals go, after gaming for about an hour in the performance mode, I'm seeing the CPU temps level out at around the mid 60s. And then switching to the quiet mode, there is an increase in temp to the mid to low 70s. So there is a trade-off to consider with that lower noise level. So yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I really wasn't sure how this build was gonna turn out when I first started planning it, but I am actually pretty happy with the results here. I think it looks way cooler than I was expecting, and I am very relieved that the Assassin actually fit without issue. And this is definitely a build that has a strong focus on CPU cooling, so I think it could make a good fit for someone that needs that for, gaming or even just productivity. Anyway, what do you think about the build? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.